Hi friends and welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, hello. My name's George Agenbar and I'm a UK music producer. Today's video is all about compression, how to use it, how to hear it, and briefly about its special applications in music production. Compression can be a difficult tool, but it can help improve our mixes and bring them to life. So stay tuned and make sure you hit the subscribe button and notification bell for new videos every Wednesday.
And things will never be the same when I hear your name since you kissed me in the rain.
When we're talking about compression and mixing, we're mainly talking about downward compressors. These are compressors that turn down the signal over a certain level that we call the threshold. This reduces the dynamic range by reducing the highest gain our signal reaches. By decreasing the dynamic range of a track, we're bringing the louder parts closer to the quieter parts. If we then turn this compressed track back up to the volume where the previous track was peaking, we end up with a track that sounds louder. And you may ask, well, why do we decrease dynamic range? Isn't that making it worse? Well, we do this because we can increase the intelligibility of our vocals in a mix, we can improve the playback of a track in a noisier environment, and also by decreasing the dynamic range, we can increase the perceived volume of our track. Compression also does other things. It can change the tone of our track. Different compressors have different sound characteristics, and this is to do with where the harmonics and distortion is added. If harmonics and distortion is added in the lower frequencies, you get a richer and deeper tone. If it's added in the higher frequencies, you get a brighter and lighter tone. You can also change the envelope of a sound. The envelope is the way that a sound changes over time. It's the attack, sustain, and release. And we have settings in compressors that allow us to change these. And therefore, using these parameters, we can get a more mellow or more punchy sound. A compressor has a lot of different parameters and controls. So let's have a look at what each of these do and how to use them. The threshold sets the minimum level the signal has to be to activate the compressor. When we say a high threshold, we mean the dial is near 0 decibels. So a signal has to be really loud to be compressed even a little bit. A low threshold is when the dial is towards -50 decibels. The majority of the signal will be compressed, as most of the time a signal will be louder than this. The ratio tells the compressor how much to reduce the signal by. A high ratio means that the signal above the threshold is reduced or squashed more. High ratios are more aggressive and easier to hear. Let's have a look at different thresholds and ratios in action. We're going to be looking at this vocal track, which is a cover of Titanium by David Guetta and Sia. I'm going to play around with various levels of thresholds and ratios to show the extremes of compression. First, as a reference, let's listen to the track normally, without any compression and without any processing.
Ricochet, you take your aim far away, far away. You shoot me down, but I won't fall. I am titanium.
Now let's set a low threshold with a high ratio. This means that the majority of the signal is going to be compressed quite heavily. So I want you to listen to how consistent the volume of all the words sound.
Ricochet, you take your aim far away, far away. You shoot me down, but I won't fall. I am titanium.
Next, let's do the opposite and use a high threshold and low ratio. This means that only the extreme peaks of our signal will be turned down ever so slightly. So I want you to listen for the loudest parts of the track and just how these words have been turned down slightly.
Ricochet, you take your aim far away, far away. You shoot me down, but I won't fall. I am titanium.
And next, let's look at a high threshold and high ratio. This means that these same extremes are going to be turned down a lot more. So listen out for the same loudest parts and hear how they've been turned down more than the previous example.
Ricochet, you take your aim far away, far away. You shoot me down, but I won't fall. I am titanium.
And finally, let's use a low threshold and low ratio. This means that the majority of our signal is going to be compressed ever so slightly. So just listen to how the volume of all the words are slightly more consistent. This can be the most subtle and hardest example to hear.
Ricochet, you take your aim far away, far away. You shoot me down, but I won't fall. I am titanium. You shoot me down.
As this is a pop vocal, I do want quite a lot of compression on the track, so I'm going to set a low threshold and relatively high ratio. But I want to be careful because I still want the vocals to sound natural.
Ricochet, you take your aim far away, far away. You shoot me down, but I won't fall. I am titanium. You shoot me down.
Next, let's look at the creative side of compression, the envelope settings. We can use these settings to make choices on how we want the delivery of our song. We can make it sound more punchy or more mellow. They can improve sloppy performances and increase perceived loudness. But if you use them wrong, your track can sound dull and lifeless, and you can achieve an unwanted pumping effect. You can find the envelope settings along the bottom row. First, let's talk about the attack dial. This controls how quickly the compressor turns on once it's detected a signal above the threshold. It controls the initial energy of the sound. It can make our track punchy or more mellow. If we have a slow attack time, we are going to get a more punchy sound. This is because the beginning of the transient of the sound will be uncompressed as the compressor won't have turned on yet. The beginning of the sounds remain untouched, and we get a bigger, more aggressive sound. If we have a fast attack time, we get a more mellow sound. This is because the compressor turns on fast enough to squish the initial transient down, so we don't get that burst of energy or volume. They can tighten up performances, but too much can leave the track sounding lifeless. It can also cause the track to be pushed further back in the mix. I'm going to show you an example of a slow and fast attack time. You really want to listen to how the energy at the beginning of the sounds changes with the different attack times.
Ricochet, you take your aim far away, far away. You shoot me down, but I won't fall. I am titanium. Ricochet, you take your aim far away, far away. You shoot me down, but I won't fall. I am titanium. You shoot me. Ricochet, you take your aim far away, far away. You shoot me down, but I won't fall. I am titanium. You shoot me down.
Now let's have a look at the release dial. This controls how long the compressor takes to turn off after the signal has dropped below the threshold value. It can make our sounds sound more or less sustained. Slow release times help smooth out dynamics, but it can also push your track back in the mix. A slow release time will give us a more sustained sound as the compressor takes longer to turn off. Let's start with a slow release time. You should hear that with a slower release time, the words sound as if they're being held on for longer than normal. Here's the original.
Ricochet, you take your aim far away, far away. You shoot me down, but I won't fall. I am titanium.
And here's the slow release time.
Ricochet, you take your aim far away, far away. You shoot me down, but I won't fall. I am titanium. You shoot me.
Now let's look at a fast release time. This should make our sounds sound shorter and as if they cut off quicker than the original. Fast release helps increase perceived loudness of the track. Low compression and a fast release sound the most natural. High compression and a fast release can sound aggressive and gritty and can lead to pumping. Again, here's the original just for reference.
Ricochet, you take your aim
fast release time.
Ricochet, you take your aim far away, far away. You shoot me down, but I won't fall. I am titanium. You shoot.
The auto button is to set an automatic release time. Logic will adjust this release time according to our audio. When turned off, the release dial determines this time. This button can be really handy for beginners to use, or if we have a very variable track. There is also the knee dial. The knee allows us to determine the transition between the compressed and uncompressed sound. When the knee is set at 1, or also known as a soft knee, there will be a smooth transition, and so the compressor kicking in will be less noticeable. When this knee is set at 0, or a hard knee, the transition will be very sudden and the compressor kicking in will be very noticeable. Sometimes when we compress, the level of our signal is reduced, so we use this makeup dial to compensate for that. We want to match the compressed signal level to our original signal level. This is to make sure that we can ensure the compressor is having a positive effect on our sound and is not just making the track louder. So there are different ways that we can use attack and release times in different genres of music. For example, in rock and fast pop, we tend to use a slow attack time and fast release time, as this gives us a punchy sound. It is important to note that in pop, vocals tend to be a lot more compressed than in rock, because this helps bring the vocals really to the forefront of our mix. In ballads, we tend to do the opposite and use a fast attack and slow release time, as this gives us a more mellow, smooth sound. But in a genre such as jazz, we don't tend to add any compression at all, and this is because a lot of jazz performances rely on natural dynamics as a form of expression. So how do we use this in practice? Start with a slow attack and fast release time. Alter the attack time first to make the transients at the beginning of the sounds as you want them. Then change the release time so that the compression breathes in time to the music. The combinations of these settings are endless, but the main point is to have a system to work through. So we've talked about the basic use of compression, but as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, there are some special applications that we use compression for. So we're going to talk over these briefly, but we can make more in-depth videos about each one of these in the future. Sidechain compressors. Examples of these are DSs and dynamic EQs. Sidechain compressors only take out frequencies or signals at points where we want it to. For example, it can reduce the bass guitar when the kick drum hits so that bass frequencies don't become overwhelming. Next week's video is going to talk more about sidechain compression, so make sure you've hit the subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss out on it. Parallel compression. This is a type of upwards compression. It works by splitting the signal into two and heavily compressing one. We then recombine the two signals. This brings up the quietest part of the track instead of bringing down the loudest peaks. An example of when we'd use this is when we want to make a drum sound more powerful. Multiband compression. Multiband compressors split all the frequencies in your mix into broad frequency bands. Each frequency band is then passed through its own individual compressor. These signals are then recombined. It's used mainly in mastering because it makes broad changes, but this really is a subject that deserves full attention in a separate video. And serial compression. This is when we use multiple compressors in a chain. Each compressor serves a different purpose, and they effectively share the workload between them. For example, the first compressor may be used to tame the general dynamic range of a track, whilst a second only focuses on the extreme peaks. We use this for inconsistent tracks, such as a live recording of a vocal, but they can also help artistically shape and colour a track. Getting compression right can hugely improve our mixes and bring them to life. The choices compression gives us as musicians and producers is amazing, and to be able to change the delivery of our track and understand how to do this is a real game changer. But the devil is in the detail where compression is concerned. It can be difficult to master and hard to actually hear what it's doing to your track. But don't worry, this is perfectly normal. Compression is usually one of the last things that engineers become comfortable and confident with. If you could hear the difference in the compression examples earlier, then you're doing brilliantly. If you come back in a week and can hear the difference then great. If it takes you as long as up to a year, then that's pretty standard. Don't worry, practice makes perfect. When we're starting out, we want to keep things as simple as possible. Don't try to change everything at once. Get used to one parameter at a time and what it does. But mostly have fun and don't be afraid to experiment with it. Thank you ever so much for watching my video. I hope you found it helpful and useful. Please let me know what you thought in the comments and if there are any videos you'd like to see. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and the notification bell for new videos every Wednesday, and I will see you again soon.